Let's see if this is going to work. So the roadmap for today is I'm going to start by, I'm just checking to see that people can actually hear me. Okay, so the roadmap for today is that I'm going to start by explaining Section 7 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And then when I'm done explaining that, we will then look at how that section applies to state or government mandated vaccination. That's the plan. And we're going to do all of this in about an hour. Now, if you go to law school or if you're in law school, you know that this topic takes a few weeks to cover. So it's going to be a tough run to try and do this in 1 hour, but I'm going to try my best to try and break it down for you in about an hour or so. So the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which I'm sure many of you have heard about, is part of the Canadian Constitution. If you haven't heard about the Constitution or the Charter, I don't know. We're going to have to cover that in some other Twitter live. But just know that there's something called the Constitution of Canada, or the Canadian Constitution, and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. This thing we're talking about today is part of the Canadian Constitution. Now, the Constitution is the highest law of the land. It is the law that tops them all. And every other law that is made in Canada is essentially subject to the Constitution. So it's a very important document in terms of the law in Canada. It kind of defines how the country is set up and the division of powers between the federal and provincial governments, and it also includes a set of human rights principles and rules, which we refer to as the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The Charter applies essentially to government action. I could spend days talking to you about this topic alone, but for our purposes here, all you have to know is that the Charter applies to government action. It is used to assess the actions of government. The idea behind this is that the government, in doing what they do, has to uphold human rights and has to uphold the freedoms and rights of Canadians. And so government action is subject to the Charter. If any government action violates the Charter, then that action obviously cannot stand. Now, it is the job of the courts to interpret the Charter and to resolve Charter disputes. I'm sure you already know this. If you feel that the government has violated your Charter rights, the place to go to is the court. Right? Get into the court system to try and get some relief for that violation. So this is my intro to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. I just want you to know where it's situated, and because it's part of the supreme law of the land, of the most important law in the land, it means that it's also a very important set of rules which governments have to comply with in Canada. Okay, Section 7, which is what we're going to talk about today, because as I said before, Section 7 is the section that most implicates the question of mandatory vaccination. Now, I should note from the outset that there are other sections that will be implicated in a case that is brought against the government for trying to mandate vaccination. One other section to keep in mind is Section 1 of the Charter, but we're not going to talk about that today. That is a different beast for a different day. And if there's enough interest, we might come back and talk about Section 1. But today, we're talking about the section that you've most likely heard that gets thrown out whenever somebody talks about mandatory vaccination. So this is the lawyer's version of Section 7. I'll let you just take it in for a second. The way it's written explains why lawyers are weird. This thing you're reading here makes no sense. So it's too wordy. But I'll let you read it. and then I'll give you the people's version. This version is yeah. Just forget this version. Let's move on. Okay, here's the people's version. Here's the version that is simplified and is easier to understand. So what that thing you just read means is that the government can take away your life, liberty, or personal security so long as they don't violate something called fundamental justice. All that gibberish over here, this is what it translates to. The government can take away your life, liberty, or personal security so long as in doing so, they don't violate something called fundamental justice. This is probably upsetting some of you right now. Like, what do you mean? I have right to life and all of this stuff. How can the government take it away? And what is this nonsense document called the Charter that's saying the government can do that? Well, the reason it functions this way is because your rights are not absolute. You do have those rights. They are protected under the Charter. But the government can, in fact, violate those rights so long as they do it in accordance with something called fundamental justice. So I want you to keep your gaze on fundamental justice. It's really important. It seems as if fundamental justice is what we're going to be spending time talking about today, because it is the fulcrum on which this whole thing swings. Okay, so this is how most of us think Section 7 works. Give me liberty or give me death. My charter rights, anytime I'm on Twitter talking about stuff, people throw the charter at me, they talk about their rights. So this is how we think it works. But Section 7, as I said before, does not in fact create absolute rights. Yes, you have a right to life. You have a right to liberty, a right to security of the person or personal security. You have all those rights. They are protected by the Charter, but they're not absolute. The government can in fact violate them so long, again, as they do so in accordance with this thing called fundamental justice. So here's how Section 7 really works. So, we're like this baby. The government took my toys, right? So the toys are life, liberty, and security of the person. So government took my toys. The question is, okay, but how did they do it? So they've taken your toys, they've taken your life, liberty, and security of the person. How did they do it? This part is key. They did it without fundamental justice. That's when you succeed under Section 7. If you can show that they did it without fundamental justice. Now, of course, it'll be nice if the government didn't mess around with us. But I got news for you. They do this all the time. They try to mess around with us. And when they do, the question really for this section is, did they do it with or without fundamental justice? So here are your Section 7 toys: life, liberty, and personal security. Or in lay language, some that people understand, your bodily integrity. So let's talk about each of these toys before we get into this whole thing about fundamental justice. All right. Starting with life. So your right to life is protected under Section 7. What this means essentially is that the government or government action cannot cause you death or increase the risk of you dying, whether directly or indirectly. An obvious example is the death penalty. The death penalty takes your life. And so a government that enacts the death penalty will be in violation of your right to life. A government that forces you into, say, for example, a situation where you're not able to access medical treatment that you need, which then poses a risk that you might die if you don't receive that treatment, would also be in violation of your right to life. So if these examples happen, the government has violated your right to life. Uh, in many situations where these kinds of things happen, the government will easily concede that they violated your right to life. And the only question becomes, have they done so in a way that jives with fundamental justice? Fundamental justice is back. Keep it in mind. It's always going to be a factor. Now, the right to life does not include government action that affects your quality of life. Just generally speaking, you can't drag the government to court saying, my life is not what is not what I want it to be. It's not optimal. I, I want to have coffee 3 times a day and I can't, or I need booze, I can't get booze. That it's not about the quality of life. It's about causing you death or increasing the risk of you dying, whether directly or indirectly. Okay, on to liberty. Your right to liberty. The government cannot physically restrain you or deprive you of your personal autonomy, which is the right to make fundamental personal or life choices. Obvious examples would be imprisonment and forced medical treatment. The government cannot force you to undergo medical treatment without your consent. Government action cannot lead to your imprisonment. If those things happen, that's a violation of your right to liberty. But we know the government imprisons people all the time. So again, the question becomes, does this jive with fundamental justice? Now, the right to liberty does not include government action that affects your property or your economic freedom. Just want to note that that's not part of the deal. Or your political freedom to your right to vote. If they take away your right to vote, that's dealt with somewhere else. The right to liberty does not include that. Now, personal security is about government action, which again, in the absence of fundamental justice, this fundamental justice thing negatively affects your health and safety, deprives you of control over your body, so violates your body, your person, your bodily integrity, or causes you physical or psychological suffering. So examples of this will be, if government were to enact a law that required the physical discipline of children, or laws that restrict abortion. These are laws that affect people's personal security, their sense of personal security, or their bodily integrity. It actually interferes with their bodies. That would be a violation of the Section 7 right to security of your person, or personal security, or bodily integrity, however you want to talk about it. But again, the question is, has the government done so in accordance with fundamental justice? Now, this right to personal security does not include government action that affects your economic capacity or rights. So you see, economic stuff does not apply here, need not apply here. I can, maybe answer questions about this later on Twitter, but the idea behind this is something that affects your sense of personal security. If government action were to affect that, then you can invoke this section. But in invoking this section, you have to show that the government has done so in a way that violates this idea of fundamental justice. Okay, so before we get into fundamental justice, which is obviously important, let's talk about Section 7 and mandatory vaccination. And, we don't actually know what kind of mandatory vaccination scheme any government in Canada right now is going to come up with. We know of this Quebec health tax, but, subsequently, I'm going to give you some scenarios and some examples, some hypotheticals around ways that the government can enact mandatory vaccination laws. But my sense is that any mandatory vaccination law will surely violate your right to security of the person, to personal security. I don't really know how the government is going to enact a mandatory vaccination scheme that doesn't interfere with that, because essentially the government is requiring you to put something in your body. I don't think it'll be a violation of your right to life. I don't see that. I don't think it'll be a violation of your liberty. It could be a violation of your liberty, depending on how they do it. But the right that will be most likely implicated is the right to your personal security. So I don't think this is going to be an issue. I think in any lawsuit in which this section is invoked, the government will just concede that yes, we're going to make you inject something into your body. The law in its effect is going to make you do that. So it's a violation of your Section 7 right to personal security. It is because the law interferes with control over your body. If they make a law saying, if you don't do this, if you don't get vaccinated, you suffer some penalty, that forces you to deal with your body in a way that it interferes with the control of your own body. It may introduce a substance into your body that you have not consented to, because obviously you're a refuser. You're somebody who doesn't want to do it. But it also will create a duty to live against your will and your sense of dignity and your sense of security of your person. So I think undoubtedly, any scheme that the government comes up with, is going to violate the right to personal security. So obviously, that's not going to be the question. To my mind, the question is going to be fundamental justice, right? Because remember, fundamental justice can take away your life, liberty, and personal security. So that's going to be the question. So we got to figure out what fundamental justice is, since it's so important. What the hell is fundamental justice? Okay, before I get into this, let me warn you. This is going to leave you more confused than where we are now. Obviously, this is lawyer territory, but let's see if we can simplify it. Fundamental justice. What the hell is this? So the first thing if you're in law school, the first thing you're going to learn is this has no precise meaning, obviously, because it's something that lawyers deal with. It has no precise meaning, which can mean that nobody actually knows what it is, or that it's something you can beat into shape however you want, or something that lawyers argue about all the time. The courts have described it as how and why the government does things in a legal system like ours. How and why the government does. I'm going to leave you with that to unpack that. It sounds basically like what the judge ate for breakfast, right? But there are some helpful clues as to what it is. Some things that courts have offered over time that gives us some clue as to what fundamental justice is. So, the Supreme Court of Canada has said it includes, again, it has no precise meaning, but it refers to the essential elements of our system of justice. Are you getting warmer? No? I don't blame you. Something that strikes the right balance between personal and societal interests. Something that is generally accepted by reasonable people. Something that is part of our legal history and traditions. Does anyone know what it is yet? It must be a legal principle, they've told us. It must be supported by significant societal consensus. It must be something we can identify and apply. It'd be nice if they just gave us a handy list of what fundamental justice is. But this is a term that is subject to interpretation. Something that, you could spend weeks in law school trying to figure out what it is and still not get a good sense of what it is. But it's so important because this is the thing on which your rights rest. This is the thing that allows the government to actually mess with those rights. So it'd be nice if we actually knew exactly what it was. But I got bad news for you. We don't. So I've given you some clues, but there are some stronger clues that I can give you as to what fundamental justice actually is. I'm going to drink some water. Give me a sec. I really hope I'm not talking to myself here. These one-way Twitter live things, kind of weird. It's not interactive. It's crazy. All right. Okay. So let's get into some stronger clues as to what fundamental justice might be. All right. Okay. Thanks. Somebody wrote to me. I said I'm not talking to myself. So that's awesome. Thanks, Chris. All right. Okay. Let's get into it. So, one way the government can violate fundamental justice is where they do something or they enact a law that doesn't fulfill the objectives that is set out to actually achieve. So, say the government wants to do something and they make a law about that thing, and they say this is the reason why we made that law. But then you read the law and you go, well, no, this is in no way related to the objectives you set out in the law. Or if government action in implementing that law or in doing whatever they do does not meet the objectives that is set out initially. So it does not actually serve to protect the public interest it is seeking to protect. That is one way you can know that the government has violated fundamental justice. In lawyer terms, we say that law or action of government is arbitrary. The head does not connect to the tail, right? So the head is the objective and the tail is the action. And those two things don't align at all. If government action is arbitrary, that's a violation of fundamental justice. So if the government were to enact a mandatory vaccination law and they set out some objectives, and you look at that law and the way it is designed, the scheme is not designed in any way that would achieve the objective that the government has set out. So if, for example, the government would say, we're trying to protect public health, but there's nothing in the way they've done it that is actually going to protect public health, then that's clearly arbitrary. The government has done something totally whack. And that is a way that the government can violate fundamental justice. So your rights cannot be taken away under this section for arbitrary actions or arbitrary law. So here's Stewie Griffin to explain an example of an arbitrary law. Well, Stewie Griffin from Family Guy, he makes a ton of arbitrary laws all the time. As you know, Stewie is a psychopath and a sociopath. And this clip is Stewie announcing some laws that he's made. I don't actually know if you can hear this. I hope you can, but I'm going to play it anyway. And if you can't, well, I'm sorry. My first time, I don't actually know if this is going to work, but let's see. All right. I hope you heard that. That's arbitrary. That's Stewie just being crazy. So that's the heads don't connect to the tails. Then that can be a way that they can take away your rights. A second way that the government action can violate fundamental justice is if the action goes too far. So they've bitten off more than they can chew. The law takes away more of your rights that it needs to accomplish its purpose. And this is important. If the government is trying to take away your right to life, liberty, and personal security, the government has to be measured in the way they approach this. If they design the scheme in such a way that it's just gone too far, and the courts determine that they can dial it back, they can still accomplish the objectives of the purpose by dialing it back, then the court will strike down that law or action for being a violation of fundamental justice. So in lawyer terms, we say the law is overbroad. An example of when law can be overbroad is when it applies to a wider class of persons than it is necessary to achieve its purpose. So, say they were to make a mandatory vaccination scheme, and the government did not have, say, a cutout for persons who are medically um, contraindicated for vaccination. So, persons who, for medical reasons, cannot get vaccinated. The government includes them too, right? Um, the court might say, well, you've gone too far. If you want to focus on persons who refuse vaccination, that might be okay. But you've now included a class of persons who, for medical reasons, cannot get vaccinated or who already have immunity. You've drafted a law that makes no sense from this perspective. It is too broad, it is overbroad, and that law or action has to fail on the basis of fundamental justice. A third way, when the government action or law does something that is not in the interest of the state, or does so in a manner that is too extreme. So in lawyer terms, we say that it is grossly disproportionate to legitimate state interest. So again, the state has an interest in doing something. Whatever they're doing is going to take away your right to life, liberty, or personal security. But they've done it in a way, for lack of a better term, that is whack, just totally crazy. It is so grossly disproportionate to anything that can be perceived as something that is in the public interest. Then that action or law has to fail for being a violation of fundamental justice. So the way we think about this is that the harm to your rights, the harm to these rights that I've articulated, life, liberty, and personal security, the harm that is being caused by that law or action outweighs any benefit that Canadians will derive from the law. Here's an example of a grossly disproportionate law. Again, Stewie Griffin, everybody. This is just so I can take a break and drink some water. It's just a clip of Stewie, so enjoy it. It's funny to me. I hope it's funny to you. That's enough. Can't stand it. Okay. All right. Oh, God, that makes me laugh. Okay. Okay. A fourth way, law that is too vague or law that is vague. So obviously, the government is going to take away your right to life, liberty, or personal security. You should at least know what the hell they're doing. If the law is too vague, such that you, who is supposed to follow the law, cannot make heads or tails of it. There's no clear standards for enforcement. The law is not very clear. If the law is too vague, then that's a violation of fundamental justice. So we've kind of come to the point where we have a better sense of what fundamental justice is. The law cannot be, or government action cannot be arbitrary. It cannot be overbroad. It cannot be grossly disproportionate. It cannot be vague. If it's any of these four things, then it will be struck down. Because what it means is that the government has attempted to take away these Section 7 toys or your rights in a way that violates those four things that I've explained. So, any mandatory vaccination scheme that the government or any government in Canada enacts, most likely provincial governments enact, I don't think the question is going to be, does it violate your rights? No, it will clearly violate your right to personal security as I've explained before, maybe even your right to liberty, depending on how they do it. The first question that I think will be contested in court will be whether the violation is in accordance with the principles of fundamental justice. So this is a big question. And I hope I've given you enough to get some sense of the kinds of considerations that will go into unpacking this when it goes to court. So the takeaway up to this point is your rights are not absolute. And the government can, in fact, violate them. And when they do, the first question we have to ask is the violation in accordance with fundamental justice? If the court finds that the violation is in accordance with fundamental justice, so all of these problems I talked about, overbreadth, gross disproportionality, arbitrariness, and vagueness don't apply. The government has knocked this one out of the park. They've made a law that is Section 7 proof. Then the courts still have to ask, is the violation justified under Section 1? We're not getting into that today. So as you can see, the trek to the realization of your rights when they've been violated by government goes through too many paths. It has to first go through this hurdle of fundamental justice, and then it has to confront Section 1, which we're not going to get into today. So in essence, a lot, at least from the perspective of the government, depends on the design of the mandatory vaccination scheme. This is why when the Premier of Quebec announced that, you hear many legal scholars saying, let's wait and see what they actually do. This is because they know that the devil is in the details. They know that the design of the scheme is what is going to determine whether or not that law passes charter scrutiny or doesn't. So, you can debate till the cows come home about the health task, is this bad or good? You're not going to get a definitive sense of whether or not it violates the charter until you actually see what exactly they've designed. So let's talk about how you could design mandatory vaccination schemes. So I've put up some designs here. All of these have been used throughout history, by the way. Some of them are no longer, obviously cannot be used today, but let's talk about them anyway. So here's hypothetical number one. The government sends, the police to get you, pin you down, and inject you. I don't think anyone's going to do this, but maybe it'll happen. I don't think it's ever going to. Any government that does this surely will face a charter challenge, and I think the charter challenge will succeed. It will succeed because this is likely to be viewed as grossly disproportionate to achieving what they want to achieve. It might also be viewed as arbitrary, to be honest. It just doesn't make sense to be running around pinning people down and injecting them forcibly. There's better ways and better designs. Many other ways you could do this. But that's one way it could be done. They could enact a law where they say, get vaccinated or get punished. You go to jail or you pay a fine, no opt-outs. No exceptions. Everyone gets vaccinated. I think this will also face most likely a successful charter challenge. Why? Because, people who can get vaccinated for medical reasons, persons who already have natural immunity because they've suffered from the disease, people who have, genuine reasons why they can't get vaccinated might go, well, this law is too broad. It's a violation of fundamental justice if it's too broad. It's applied to people who it doesn't need to apply to. So I think this is a problematic design. You're likely not to see this design anytime soon in Canada. A third design. This one has been tried out actually in other jurisdictions. Historically in Canada, it was tried out in the 19th century. And I believe New Brunswick recently tried to do something along these lines for childhood vaccination. Uh, so you get vaccinated, or you have to pay a fine, or you're excluded from something. You can opt out for medical reasons, or if you have immunity to a disease. But those are the only opt outs. That's it. Um, this one, I think, again, we're starting to get away from sort of the problems of fundamental justice as we go through these hypotheticals, because this one seems to be contained to a group of persons who are refusing for reasons that uh, don't have anything to do with uh, um, illness or what's the word I'm looking for, because it's contraindicated for them, or because they have immunity to a disease. Design number 4: get vaccinated or get punished in some way. You can opt out for medical reasons, immunity to the disease, religious and or philosophical reasons. This scheme already exists in Canada. Ontario has this scheme for childhood vaccinations, even though theirs starts, with for school age children, I believe. But there are opt outs. The problem with this, obviously, is that when you have opt outs, people are going to, the more opt outs you have, the more it is prone to abuse. People are going to opt out, whether for genuine reasons or because the opt out is broad enough to allow them to opt out. So this one might not catch as many people, but I think it is more charter proof in terms of being able to survive uh, the fundamental justice inquiry. And then lastly, they get vaccinated or pay a fine or a health tax, as Quebec is attempting to do. Let's dig into this, since this one is in the news right now. So let's talk a bit about this. I think with this scheme, it's important to note that in assessing this, you have to ask yourself, what is the objective of the law? What are they trying to achieve? And then, obviously, if they're saying get vaccinated, I think it's going to be a violation of your right to personal security. And then the question becomes, how do your objectives line up to the scheme? And how can we use the criteria of fundamental justice? Again, how can we use arbitrariness, overbreadth, gross disproportionality, and vagueness to assess what they've done? Now, I'm doing this without the benefit of the details, right? This is all we have. They're going to implement a health tax, or, as I see it, they're going to ask you to pay a fine. Um, but we don't have the details of how they're going to do it. So I'm just going to speculate for the rest of this presentation. So the first question, obviously, is it designed in a way that achieves its objectives? Well, I could answer that question if I actually saw the design. I don't know what the design is. But the one thing I can say is we can actually try to guess at what the objectives of the law might be. If you're asking people who have refused vaccination to get vaccinated or pay some kind of health uh, levy or a fine, I think this is what Quebec is going to offer as reasons as to why they're doing that. They want to protect public health. Well, that's a reason everyone can understand. They want to prevent those persons who are unvaccinated from infecting vulnerable persons. I think this is a stronger reason. It's a stronger objective. I think this is one we're likely to see because the argument will be if they remain unvaccinated, there's a chance that they will infect people who cannot get vaccinated, say by reason of age. So, people who are under 5 years of age, people who, for medical reasons, who are immune compromised, can't get vaccinated. They then pose a risk to those kinds of people. Now, of course, how that works out in terms of justifying that reason will depend a lot on, scientific facts, the kinds of evidence that they bring to bear on the question of whether or not this is actually going to happen and whether or not that risk is coming specifically and directly from persons who are unvaccinated. But I think it's going to be an objective that is offered. A third objective might be to protect the healthcare system. And I think the Premier of Quebec referenced this when he announced this. So this idea that hospitals are getting overwhelmed, they are delaying surgeries and healthcare for people, and it's because people refuse to get vaccinated, and we now have hospitalizations for COVID made up mostly of persons who are unvaccinated, and that is putting a stress on hospitals and on the healthcare system and on healthcare workers. All of this might be offered as reasons for the law. If these are the objectives, then the question becomes, uh, whatever scheme they come up with, this health tax or levy or whatever you want to call it, or whatever they do, does that line up with these objectives in a way that does not violate fundamental justice? Right away, we can dismiss certain things. I don't think there are going to be issues when we're assessing fundamental justice. I don't think the law is going to be vague. Chances are it won't be. But I think the other three might be in play. So let's look at it very quickly. So the first thing will be, is the law arbitrary? Did I skip that? Oh, I think I did that already. Is it designed in a way that achieves its objectives? It is difficult to answer this one until I see the law. Without seeing the law, you have to see what they're doing to know if the head matches up to the tail. Now, I think, just based on what I've heard, that it is likely to pass the test of arbitrariness. Obviously, if you want to get people vaccinated, asking them to pay a levy is one way to do that. If people are refusing to get vaccinated and you want to force them to get vaccinated, it makes sense to say, well, I'm going to impose a fine on them. So I think the head and the tail come together. So I don't think this law that Quebec is trying to come up with is going to fail on the grounds of arbitrariness. How about overbreadth? The question we have to ask here is, who does it apply to and who is affected? Is it too broad? Does it go beyond who it needs to apply to, for example? So they have to draft it in a way that catches these vaccine refusers, but does not apply to people who it shouldn't apply to. So the question is, does it take away the rights of a class of persons in a way that does not line up to its objectives? If you want to protect public health, if you want to protect the healthcare system, if you want to protect the vulnerable, have you, for example, captured the right target in terms of the persons that you're trying to make subject to vaccination? So I think, for example, if the law was drafted in a way to catch anti-vaxxers, maybe. If it's catching people who are immune compromised, if it's catching people who have genuine reasons, maybe people even have religious reasons to get vaccinated, it might run into an overbreadth problem. But again, it's difficult to know for sure if this is going to be the case until you see what they've actually done. Gross disproportionality. Is the law too whack? Is it so crazy that when you read it, you're going to go, oh my God, you guys have done a crazy job on rights here, on violating rights here, and we don't see any benefit whatsoever to Canada. The objectives are not going to be met with this law. There's no benefit whatsoever to Quebec or to any other province or to people of Canada, or the harm to rights is so great that whatever that benefit is does not justify the violation of the right. I don't know how they're going to draft something like this, especially since there's lawyers doing it. So I don't think this is going to be an issue, but I've been surprised before by crazy governments. So I'm going to reserve judgment until I see what they actually do. And then vagueness. If you read it and you go, what the hell? I don't get it. It's too vague. I don't know what they're talking about. Like, nobody understands this law. Then it will fail for vagueness. I don't think this is going to be an issue for whatever Quebec is trying to do, or in fact for most mandatory vaccination schemes. unless you have like really terrible lawyers doing the drafting. But a lot on the vagueness question is going to depend on the design and on the way that design is expressed in legislation or in whatever form that the government actually uh, produces. All right, that is all, folks. We're done. I hope this made some sense, but the gist of it really is that your rights are not absolute. Section 7 rights, this right to life, liberty, and personal security, not absolute. I know this may disappoint some people. Maybe you're thinking now, I have to move out of Canada. I want to be somewhere where my rights are, it's freedom or I die. But that's not the way this works. It's really about the perfect balance between what the government wants to achieve and its impact on your rights. And Section 7, in many ways, has this sort of self-contained process of doing this analysis. Before you even step out of it, you have to do an analysis where you're balancing these rights against the objectives and the design of what the government has done. And then beyond that, you then have to get into a question of Section 1, which is a topic for a different day. But for today, we now know the rights are not absolute. It depends on this crazy thing called fundamental justice, which you have to go to law school to understand, but which I hope you now have some sense of. It's really about good design, appropriate design that impairs your rights in a very minimal way. It's measured. It is not too crazy. It is clear what they're doing. There's good, solid objectives behind it, and the government has done its best to try and uphold those objectives in a way that is measured, decent, and something that we all can say, you know what? We see what they're doing, and we're ready to accept the harm to rights because the benefit to society outweighs the harm to those rights. That's it. Twitter life is over. I'm going to go pour myself a drink. I suggest you do the same. All right. Cheers, people.